The webinar is now broadcasting to all attendees. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of Norfolk and further afield. And good evening, Patrick Barkham. Patrick, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Nick. And I'm very happy to be here. And I love this whole broadcasting from our little rooms.
Well, we at Norfolk Wildlife Trust are a tiny bit nervous about it because this is the first foray that we have done into broadcasting live. And so fingers crossed that it'll all go well. But you are looking disgustingly well. Have you been living your life outdoors for the last 3 months?
This is no, I've been doing lots of Zoom and tapping on the laptop like this. But no, I got out today, escaped essay rewriting. I was going to say hell, it probably was that, and I went up to Sea Paulin and I had a swim with the little, as the little terns dived in around me. There was a big sea mist going on up there, so it was all atmospheric and lovely.
That is magical.
And wonderful.
Wonderful. Oh, well, that will have refilled your soul for talking this evening with us about Wild Child, your fantastic new book. Those of us who are online, here is Patrick's new book. You should have seen its wonderful cover on advertising and on others of Patrick's events. Now, for those joining us, is there anybody there? Give us a shout. This is a free event coming to you from Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and it is the first of all of our online events because we're unable to run a programme of events at our visitor centres, of course, during the COVID crisis pandemic. It is a free event. However, should you be moved by Patrick's wonderful book and by what he has to say to us about children in nature and wish to make a donation to our Children and Nature Fund, David, who is our producer, David Fieldhouse, who is the engagement officer at our wonderful Cley and Salthouse Marshes Nature Reserve up on the North Norfolk coast. David is producing this event. Now, he's behind scenes, but if we run into a crisis, I'll be calling on his help. I'm hoping we won't run into a crisis. David will be popping up a link to our Children and Nature Fund, but essentially it is norfolkwildlifetrust.org.uk/CAN. He will also be popping up, I believe, there in the chat. Yes, we have, thank you very much, a link to norfolkwildlifetrust.org.uk/CAN. He will also be popping up a link to a place where you can buy Patrick's wonderful book. Here it is again, Wild Child, available in all good bookshops. However, it is particularly available through Wild Sounds and Books. Now, our great friends based at Salthouse, Wild Sounds and Books, stock all of our visitor centres with books and various other things. And they are extremely supportive of conservation and in particular of Norfolk Wildlife Trust. And if you purchase Patrick's wonderful book through Wild Sounds and Books, following the link, which David has put in the chat, please do that, a donation of 10% of what you spend will be made to Norfolk Wildlife Trust. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much, Duncan at Wild Sounds and Books. Now, that's not just 10% on Patrick's book, because should you follow that link, Duncan was telling me today, and buy Patrick's wonderful book, and then buy all of Patrick's other 4 books, then a donation of 10% will be made on your entire spend. And as of today, £110 has been raised in this way through the sale of Patrick's book, and Wild Sounds and Books will very kindly round this up to 150. So let's see if we can multiply this enormously. Now, later on, people are very, very welcome to ask us questions in the Q&A. Now, I'm noticing things are already popping up. Here we are. We have people popping up in the Q&A. Now, if you have questions for Patrick, please do feed them to us. What will happen is that I will mark some of the questions. Some of them we will try to answer with me reading them out to Patrick. Others of them we will try to bring you online. If David's technical brilliance allows, I will enable some of them. So the earlier you get your questions in, the better, please, because that will allow me to flag up super interesting questions, which we will then refer from you straight to the great Patrick Barkham. So if you can get your questions in early, that's absolutely brilliant. I can flag them up. Now, again, one point about housekeeping. This is the very first time we've done a live event of any sort, and so there might be the odd technical issue. It's a fairly stormy, muggy night, and I'm in North Norfolk, where Wi-Fi is not famously good, so we might have the odd technical difficulties. Same with you, Patrick, same even with David, who's based in Norwich. So if something happens, bear with us, we will attempt to sort it out. And if you are unable, for some reason you drop out, the whole thing will be loaded to our website as a catch-up, and just watch out on our website for that. Now, I have spoken far, far too much, because Patrick, this is meant to be all about you, and third time of asking about Wild Child. So Patrick, I'm going to throw the floor, the virtual floor, open to you. Tell us a little bit about where Wild Child came from, its genesis, what it means to you, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Sure, thanks, Nick. Becoming a parent is a life-changing event for everyone, and so it was for me when I had twins with my wife Lisa 8.5 years ago. And I, like many people, I'd moved away to the big city from Norfolk, where I grew up, and like many people, I came back at the first sign of children to avail myself of free grandparental help and return to my heartland, which is the Norfolk countryside, really. But I started reflecting on how my children's childhood was going to be so different from my own. I grew up in a village on the edge of Reefham, which is a small town in mid-Norfolk, and I pretty much roamed free in my childhood in the 80s and early 90s. And even at sort of 10 years old, I'd be cycling 3 miles to primary school by myself, and me and my little neighbour would go and play on Booton Common, which of course is now a Norfolk Wildlife Trust nature reserve, on our own without any adult company. And I realised that my twin girls now are 8 years old, 8.5, and they've never been out into the countryside without nearby adult supervision, almost never had any time without adult eyes upon them. And that's such a radical change. Childhood has moved indoors without us really appreciating or realizing. And so I wanted to explore why and what we as parents and grandparents could do about it. And I also wanted to, because having children, you become a bit more rooted to your local patch, and I wanted to explore and celebrate the kind of joys of nature that everyone can find. And I really hope I've written an inclusive book that is as much for people who live in urban areas and cities and people of all backgrounds, and the sort of wonders that we can find even in a big city, whether it's a peregrine falcon whizzing overhead or just a wood pigeon, you know, talking to us from a rooftop. And so that was my kind of intent with Wild Child. I thought, Nick, would it be okay if I just did a little reading? Just
okay, it will be magnificent. It will be magnificent. Hit us with a reading, Patrick.
So sort of half of Wild Child, I went and volunteered for Dandelion Education, which is an outdoor nursery based in Aylsham, and it's very brilliant and progressive, and children are outdoors in all the weather. So quite a lot of Wild Child is me there, sort of observing how children react to the natural world around us. And then about half of the book is my own experiences with my own children in our garden. And we lived for a bit in Norwich next to the fantastic Earlham Cemetery, which is a wonderful wild area, and cemeteries in urban spaces, particularly older ones, amazing places for children to play and us to discover nature. But then we moved, and we now live in Hoverton, which is quite a large suburban village, and we're next to an industrial estate, so we're nowhere special. But this is a little thing that went on in our garden. So when we arrived in our house, we've got a lovely garden, but it was pretty lifeless. So I set about sort of rewilding it. My new garden pond is not an unequivocal triumph during a heat wave. My sole yellow flag iris dies. 2 dead frogs appear floating, face down in the water like murder victims. Soon afterwards, we receive a surprising visitor. The most surprising thing is that I spot it before the children. A head glides across the pond. I idly follow it as I clear tea from the kitchen table. I assume the head is a frog's, but it keeps sliding out of the water. A newt. But then the head keeps coming. What? A snake! A snake in the pond! Grass snake in the pond, I yell. At least, I think it is. Millie, Esme, Ted and I watch it from the window. We have a fine view. It has a pursed expression on its face as if set in disapproval, and a dainty collar of black and white around its green neck. Definitely a grass snake. I lift the children up so they can see it better. Esme has vanished. Suddenly, she appears outside the kitchen window, darting, reaching. She's grabbed a snake. She's holding it up. I run out of the door and round the corner. Esme is caressing the snake, utterly delighted, its tail wrapped tight around her wrist. I'm disconcerted by what she's done, by her confidence, her skill, her fearlessness. The snake seems fine, thank goodness, and emits a pungent smell as a deterrent. Rotten onions, says Esme, with a child's typical precision. After we've admired it, she releases it into the pond and it slides away rapidly. We hope there's a nest somewhere, and we hope we haven't scared it away from our pond. For the world of snakes has gained a fan for life.
I should say that from my reading of the book, Patrick's book is full of those wonderful little views into the private lives of children. I almost feel it's like a natural history, that you are in a very beautiful and loving way observing your own children, observing the children that you work with, but as animals in their own habitat.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Yeah, there's a lovely quote. David Attenborough is often asked, particularly by school children, what his favourite animal is, and he always replies his favourite animal is a 3.5-year-old human child.
Oh,
yeah, and that's such a great answer, isn't it? And I've had some really nice reviews, and one of them actually pointed out, I hadn't realised this, that there's almost complete absence of children from adult nature writing. I mean, there's often an absence of people, isn't there? But children just do not figure at all. And so for our sort of nature writing with children, we rely on kind of old books from our childhood, like whether it's Winnie the Pooh or BB's, Brendan Chase. But so it was really nice to be able to, I did kind of want to not treat, it's nice to dissolve that division, because we're an animal, aren't we? And I think part of the problem is we believe we're apart from the rest of the world, and it was nice to kind of try and show that we are one species among many.
Yes, and that definitely comes across in the book, that you are observing children as they observe the natural world and as they grow in it, and that biophilia, as Edward Wilson would call it, that intense need that we have for the natural world. Now, I have a question for you. First of all, before I ask this question, I want to quote to you a few of your own words, beginning actually with your first book, The Butterfly Isles, in which you write, "As adults, we lose our sense of wonder about these spectacular and common garden nymphalidae. Peacocks are probably the only peacocks are probably only properly appreciated by those true connoisseurs of butterflies, children," which is such a lovely observation. And again, shortly after that, "I had not looked so closely at anything as small as this trembling butterfly for months or maybe years. How often do we as adults study things, really look at them and pore over every tiny detail?" So I have a feeling that actually this idea of children in nature is deeper rooted than, or it's come through all of your writing, really. So moving now on to Wild Child, a couple of things that you say there. "Children are tremendous shamans and shapeshifters. Given the freedom, they enthusiastically take on the form of all sorts of beasts. I have repeatedly been struck by how inspiring it is to work alongside children of all ages. They are the most open, fair-minded and adaptable work colleagues I've ever had, and they remind me how to make the most of each moment and how to seize the miracle of another day on earth." What an utterly, utterly beautiful observation. And my question in relation to those, I'm very sorry to read them so bad. It's difficult to be reading things up and down like this so badly. I get the feeling from a lot of what you write, and there are one or two things in Coastlines as well. You talk about the freedom of children on beaches. Do you yearn for your own childhood?
Oh, God.
It feels to me as if there is a longing for an innocence and a relationship with nature that you feel as an adult you've lost.
Good question. Good question. And thank you for picking out that bit from the Butterfly Isles. I've forgotten all about that, you know. So
it's funny, when I read Wild Child, it came to my mind straight away. Hang on, this has been in his head for a while.
Yeah. I'm sure you're correct, and I'm sure I do. And yearn for childhood, and I think that's why so many of us, this is a random association, why so many of us love Toy Story, because those films just beautifully brought across that feeling of childhood being this lost kingdom that we as adults had moved away from and we could look back at. And I lived right next to Booton Common for the first 9 years of my life, and we moved, and we only moved to the other side of Reetham, so we only moved about 1.5 miles away in the same valley. But that, and it's probably a testimony to the wonderful happy childhood I had, but that was a major trauma for me as a 9-year-old, being wrenched from this place that I had bonded so deeply with. And you know, I have no memories of the house that I lived in until I was 9, but I remember everything about the garden and the common and the outdoor world. And so I do, and in some ways that preserved that period of childhood. I'm sure many listeners, watchers have had similar experiences with their own childhood homes, and so yeah, I think I've often, I don't know, some of us maybe are born to be more nostalgic than others, but I think I've often yearned to get back there. And having children does give you a little corridor back, and you know, through parental play with our own children, we can sometimes rediscover half-buried memories and pleasures from childhood and so on. And the more I think about my working life, the more I realize that and I don't think I'm a particularly creative writer, like I've never been able to write fiction, for example, but any degree of creativity I have in my work is entirely related, not, I think, and no offense to, so I had some wonderful teachers too who inspired me, but is related to my childhood and my family, and not anything else, you know, not formal learning. And that, so I was really struck. I do mention in Wild Child a bit about research, obviously, about the kind of importance of green spaces for our mental and our physical well-being, but also our creativity. And I've really been struck in all the volunteering I've done. And I still volunteer at St John's, our local state school in Hoverton that runs a little forest school. I'm really struck by how being outdoors in natural spaces is a sort of, fires a sort of starting gun for children's imaginations, and they imagine and they create and they play in a way that obviously they don't play when they're fixed to an electronic screen that all us parents and grandparents get so worried about.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Well, that brings me really to my second question, which is, again, reading your books in general, there's this very strong sense of learning together, but not just learning together. You mentioned this in the list of activities you propose at the end. A lot of it is actually parents or adults experiencing nature with children, not parents teaching children about nature. But I have a strong sense you see children to be learned from, but adults have a huge amount to learn about the natural world from children.
Yeah, definitely. And your first question and those quotes sort of brought that alive, didn't they? And children can teach us to look properly at the world and to look at detail. And I'm always struck by things I've never considered and questions I've never considered that are routinely spotted by my children and asked by my children. And you notice even at an extremely young age, you know, toddler age at 2 years old, children are transfixed by all kinds of different mini beasts and moved by them and intrigued by them, and of course we needed this knowledge of our surroundings and our fellow species to evolve and become the animal that we've become. But I think there's more than that, isn't there? And it's about finding joy in these things and being in the moment, and certainly children teach us all of that. On your sort of point about what adults can do, I think there's this real fear among parents who know nothing about the natural world that if they take their children out into the woods or whatever, it's going to be a disaster because their children are going to be bored and the parents aren't going to be able to do anything to help. And it comes back to this idea that unfortunately we're sort of afflicted by today, which is that we have to organize everything for our children, and we absolutely don't. And the font of all children's creativity is self-directed, and children discovering things for themselves. And certainly when I think of my most influential experiences in the natural world, for example, my love of butterflies very much came from the fact that my dad and I did it together. And my dad, who taught environmental science at UEA and knew a lot of things about botany and birds and so forth, didn't have any knowledge of butterflies, so it was something that we learned together. And that idea that as a child you can tell your parents something, you know, is so much more powerful than just having stuff sort of pointed out to us. And so I do think the greatest gift as parents and grandparents we can give young children is to just facilitate their free play in green spaces where there is some degree of wildness.
That comes across actually in coastlines as well. Again, I'm spying on you, seeing links all the way between. The beach is exciting for older children precisely because parents dissolve into the background. That sense of a freedom of space where they get to be themselves and express themselves.
My 8-year-old Esme is particularly, she's reached that stage now where she's yearning for freedom. And by far the most successful walks are those where I've let Esme and Millie and maybe some of their little friends run off out of sight and do what they perceive to be really daring and dangerous, and disappear and kind of vanish for 10 minutes, and it becomes slightly, you know, unfortunately good parenting is kind of seen as synonymous with perpetual supervision these days, and it's hard to know how we get out of that mindset. But if we can and give our children just glimmers of freedom, I think they get so much confidence and resilience and independence and creative thinking from that.
And in fact, I'm just looking for it, forgive me while I do. There's a lovely quotation. Now, you make the point very beautifully. It brought me to tears, genuinely. At the end, the dedication. The book is worth reading alone for the dedication to Patrick's children, which brought me to tears. It was one of 2 points where I cried, and I'm about to reference the other one. But at the end, Patrick makes the point that this is a book for all 3 children, about all 3 children. It's just that Esme is the one who has the most visceral relationship with nature as a small person. And you describe her in this way, if I may. If we tell Esme off, say, at the meal times with some Edwardian parental plea to remain at the table for a minute after she's bolted her food, she runs away. Away is our garden. She hasn't run further yet, but I expect she will. Sometimes I surreptitiously watch her after she flees grown-up oppression and see how she hides like a fawn in the long grass of the meadow, lying down and gazing at the sky or bending over, medicating her pain with absorption in another species, stripping the seeds of a piece of grass or trying to catch a grasshopper. She needs a nest in nature, its safety, security, and freedom. Just exquisite. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely beautiful, but it captures that idea of children having the freedom to express themselves. Yeah. Can I jump on to, jump on to my third question? I'm noting how quickly the time is racing past. When you wrote this book, when you were planning its launch, etc., the extraordinary curveball of COVID-19 hadn't reared its head in our world. Now, obviously, it has reared its head, and I think it probably highlights some of the injustices in our society where access to nature is concerned. I saw for the first time in months in their garden the other day, my godfather and his wife, and they said what everybody I know has been saying, which is, aren't we lucky to live in North Norfolk, where we have been able to escape, where we have been able to walk, where we have gardens, where there is somewhere to walk nearby. And I just want, this was the other quotation that brought me, in addition to your dedication to your children, that actually brought a lump to my throat. And forgive me, I forget the name of the school for children who are struggling in an urban setting that you visited in one of the chapters.
There was Wild Things in Nottingham, who worked with refugees, and then there was Wilderness Schooling in Newcastle, who worked with children who were perceived to be underachieving at school.
I believe that this is the school that works, Wild Things, which works with refugees. We help a child fall in love with nature, and we don't know if they'll ever be able to access it again, Kate thinks for a moment. At least the children know now that there's a place called the woods, she says. It may call to them at any point in the future. It's better to know there's a bit missing. It might be something you can use in your later life, she says, to know that the woods can make you feel better. Now that struck me as both extraordinarily beautiful and at the same time deeply painful. The idea that they might not be able to have that relationship with nature going into adulthood or young adulthood and then adulthood and parenthood. So anything you want to say about that, of course, but also, do you feel that the COVID crisis has sharpened the divide and the angst of those unable to have access to nature? Because here in Norfolk, and some of our viewers will be from outside Norfolk, of course, do you feel that well, you know how lucky we are, but many of the people reading your book won't have that access?
Yeah, Kate Millman, who said that, is a really inspiring person and created this project for getting newly arrived refugee children from inner city Nottingham out into the woods, and she spoke incredibly about the impact upon them, but also about the reality of life for these children who arrived as newly arrived migrants, kind of right at the bottom of pecking order of society. They had nothing, and they were in a urban society where it was all about, you know, what you own. And suddenly in the woods, none of that matters. And in the woods, everyone is equal. And she saw that, and she saw how we sort of. I'd never previously considered, you know, I sort of assumed that most of our refugees come from big cities, but a lot of them only, if they did come from a big city, their parents or grandparents came from the countryside. And so a lot of these kids, when they're first brought to the woods, see a lot of things that they recognise. And it's British, the British poor, who are disconnected from nature by sort of 8 or 10 generations. So it's an even bigger disconnect for them. And certainly the coronavirus crisis, I've lost count of the number of people who've said, you know, I've discovered a footpath I never knew existed. I've loved being in one spot and being able to really get to know my neighbourhood and the nature therein. And it's been a wonderful moment of awakening to the importance and joy that we can get from our neighbourhood nature. But as you say, it really highlights the inequalities here. And there's been some work done that's shown that during the lockdown, that people living in more deprived communities have less access to public green space. And there's 2.7 million people in Britain don't have public green space within a 10-minute walk of home. And I passionately believe that we're now an urban people. 83% of us live in cities, and access to green space, high quality green space, given its the hundreds of papers proving its benefits to our mental and physical well-being, it should be a modern day human right. Access to public green space. We should, and just as the government drew up the national parks in the depths of the Second World War, you know, crisis is an opportunity to build a much more positive world. And whilst there's all these amazing charities, you know, from Norfolk Wildlife Trust's own work with Sure Start centres, for example, in more deprived parts of Great Yarmouth and Thetford, to programmes like Wild Things in Nottingham, there's people doing amazing things all the time against the odds. But wouldn't it be wonderful if the government took it on board and said, we're going to create a new generation of urban parks to guarantee that, so everyone's got within 10 minutes of home urban green space. Because you know, a lot of people, I lost counter the number of people while I was searching this book said, you know, forest schools, it's all very well, but isn't this a middle class concern? And they're dead right, because you can't be campaigning for wild green space when you're worried about putting food on your table. But I don't have to worry so much about putting food on my table, so I can campaign for it and say, we've got to do this stuff. And I feel absolutely no embarrassment in that, because public green space has been shown scientifically to be more beneficial to more deprived communities, because they can't buy green experiences in the way that the more affluent of us can. And because, you know, in a park, in a wood, you don't have to consume, you don't have to pay for things. You can, I mean, you know, even urban green spaces can be a source of free food. And I was very struck when I lived in London that the only people I saw blackberry picking were newly arrived migrants from Poland and Lithuania, you know, who just had a slightly more intimate relationship with the wild from where they'd come from, and they were busy picking blackberries on an old railway line in London. So, you know, but yeah, the government, it would be wonderful if the government could step in and offer some really structured financial support for all the amazing stuff that's happening at grassroots level.
And so many inequities in our society have been highlighted by the COVID crisis, but at the same time, so many of them are related with this question of quality of life and access to these beauties that are an inherent and a rightful part of who we are. And so many of the societies that have suffered worst from all aspects of the COVID crisis have been the very same sectors of our society who suffer from a lack of access to nature.
Yeah. I mean, nature, you know, it boosts our immune systems. It keeps us well. Obviously, I think ideas of nature cure can be overstated, and they can also be patronising to the sick, because if someone's really sick, and then that includes depressed, nature isn't necessarily going to cure you. And even Richard Mabey, who coined that phrase with his wonderful book Nature Cure, admitted that in the depths of his depression, he couldn't go out and be healed by nature. So the healing power of nature, I think, can be overstated, but it is something that we need as a species. We've evolved, you know, for 250,000 years. You know, we've lived outdoors, and we've been an outdoor creatures, and it's only in the last 10 generations that we've moved so much of our lives indoors, and we can see it's making our children unwell, and we can see the type of schooling that we choose. And that would be the other thing, that if I could wave a magic wand and, you know, change things, would be to give schools financial support and help to have outdoor schooling. And suddenly, you know, with this bizarre shutdown, where the government's decided that schooling is no longer something that it provides for universally, the solution is to have schooling outdoors over the summer and facilitate that. But it needs resources and training and imagination, and this isn't criticising teachers at all. It's a question of resources and leadership from the government, and sadly that's not forthcoming. But, you know, the coronavirus crisis is giving us the ability to dream a different world and to see a different world, and certainly the absence of traffic from our streets has been a wonderful blessing. And I think it shows us that maybe we could have more of that. And why couldn't we have car-free Sundays? You know, key workers obviously accepted, but car-free Sundays once a month perhaps, and that would liberate our children, because one of the main reasons why they've moved indoors is that rather than removing the danger from our roads, we've removed our children from danger, and we've prioritised the rights of adults to drive a car over the rights of our most vulnerable members of society, who are our young people, our children. So, I'm straying into rant mode. Wild Child is not a rant. I hope it's a celebration and an inspiration.
But it brings up so many important issues, and you touched on them. We've got very few questions that have come into the question and answer. If anyone still has one, please do pop us a question in the question and answer. We'd be delighted to ask Patrick, or you can if we're able to bring you in. But because we've got very few questions, I'm going to keep asking you.
Yeah, please do.
Right. This is one, actually, the quotation is from Coastlines, but it's directly relevant to Wild Child and to everything we've been talking about. It is currently fashionable for conservationists to pretend there is no tension between people enjoying a natural area and wildlife. But of course, there always will be. How we manage this will define how much freedom we give our children and how well we protect the coast. And I wondered really whether you had any comment on that, because we as an organisation at Norfolk Wildlife Trust, we're constantly up against this coalface of making nature reserves available to people because of the tremendous value they have in our lives. But I know that several members of staff and trustees will be listening this evening. As we open up nature reserves, in our absence, marsh harriers are nesting close to paths in a way they've never done before. Avocets are fledging chicks right beside scrapes in a way that they've never done before. And we see that they're adapting to nature reserves without us. Do you have any thoughts on this? Well, what do you say, the tension between us exploring nature and nature itself?
It's such a good question and such an interesting debate, isn't it? And there are no easy answers, but in some ways there's a sort of paradox in that because so much of and I know we're blessed in England, certainly compared to other countries like the US, with an enormous number, for example, of public footpaths, but because so much of our land is private, nature reserves have become one of the few places where you can go, and they're sort of open generally and accessible, and so they're places where we can wander and be inspired by the natural world. And obviously without that there's no hope for us repairing our slightly dysfunctional relationship with other species in the natural world, and children are such an important part of that. But but there have to be.
That sounded alarmingly like a dry cough, Patrick.
Yeah.
You've been staying at home for a week.
I am in extremely good health and just slightly unused to. It's really hot in my study today. It's like that humidity, isn't it? And so my throat's drying out. But I think we have to have dedicated spaces for nature, and we have to close off areas of the beach, or else we're going to lose all our nesting ring plovers, for example. And you know, we have to manage dogs, and we have to keep dogs out of nature reserves, and people have to learn to respect that. And it's really interesting in the coronavirus crisis, whenever I've gone out, I've been really heartened by the number of people, so many more people I've seen out enjoying, just like the riverside at Horsted Mill. I jogged past there yesterday, it's full of people, Colchester Green and those kind of spaces. But we need more space that isn't nature reserve, that isn't kind of our most precious habitats for other species, where we can kind of let loose and as humans just really enjoy it. And it would be lovely to get some more parks and turn some of our less useful farmland and I mean, you see it with things like the Forestry Commission woods that perhaps aren't, since coniferization, are no longer blessed with amazing species, and they become these great sort of leisure woodlands, and that seems like a good idea to me. But I certainly think nature conservation organisations, charities like the Wildlife Trust, whilst obviously doing their utmost, as NWT does, to facilitate access and encourage children and all the educational programs and so forth, you do need to have fences and boundaries and keep people away. And as you say, we've seen just how in our absence, as we've all been kept closer to home, how lots of things have boomed and blossomed and bred and built nests in places where they wouldn't have otherwise done. And that also shows us the potential, doesn't it, of where things could be and go and get to if we somehow trod more lightly. And there's been some scare stories too, haven't there, about portable barbecues laying waste to swathes of the New Forest, and people misbehaving and so on. And we're going to get that as more people go outdoors, but we've somehow got to educate people, haven't we? And I don't believe the situation is solved by keeping people in the shops and the cities. That's never going to be a solution to the extinction crisis that we're facing.
What you say about not necessarily nature conservation land that is better for nature and better for people to explore feeds very much into what we call at the Wildlife Trust our nature recovery network, which is about connecting between, so the pristine nature reserve, the very high quality habitat for nature, being reconnected through a whole network of habitats across farmland, across municipal land, across brownfield sites, through cities, through towns, through our gardens, so that nature is vibrant and loud everywhere, so that everyone's quality of life, both wild species and humans. Now, I'm hoping David is now going to be able to bring in Richard Twine, who has a question for Patrick. Are you able? Richard Twine, welcome. I'm noticing that his microphone is still muted. David, do you need to unmute him, or does Richard? There, Richard, you should be live. Richard, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please ask a question for Patrick.
I am. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm a lecturer at Edge Hill University, and I do a little bit of teaching on children and sustainability issues. And one of the topics that comes up is related to how to communicate with children about difficult topics such as climate change. So my question for Patrick is basically, how do you approach the topic of communicating with children about disturbing nature-related topics? So I'm thinking of, for example, our culture's killing of animals for food and meat consumption, and how that relates to lots of obviously the biodiversity crisis and so on, and then also secondly the topic of climate change. How do you communicate with children about climate change?
That's a great question, Richard. Thank you for that. And I read a thing in a very good American book about teaching children about nature and so on, and by a guy called Scott Sampson, and he was suggesting that we shouldn't be teaching children about environmental disaster until they're about 8 or 9, and until that moment he felt they just needed joy and connection. And I'm not sure I agree with that, but I also think that, and there's lots of brilliant stuff going on in schools, but I know my children have burst into tears when they've read quite sort of worthy picture books about pollution and climate change, and we were watching one of the big Attenborough blockbusters, and again the topic, and Attenborough obviously treads over this very lightly, some would say too lightly a lot of the time, but even then the mention of threats to these animals reduced my children to kind of anguish and despair, and the last thing we want them to feel is emasculation and despair. I saw it at this Forest School Nursery Dandelion where I volunteered. They had this brilliant philosophy for children sessions where over lunch they would discuss things like animal rights, and it was amazing that you could have 4-year-olds making really quite sophisticated philosophical points about animal rights and eating animals. Certainly I think we could do more in our schools, and again this is not to criticize teachers but just the rigidity of the national curriculum, but we could do more with just where our food comes from, and that's the sort of starting point really for environmental awareness in many cases. Where does what we eat come from? And we're very afraid of death as a society, and very afraid of talking about all kinds of death with children. And yeah, I certainly saw our encounters with the natural world, my own children's encounters, as being one way of talking about death in a way that didn't scare them, because when they see a dead bird, for instance, they're curious and they want to know, is it really dead? Why is it dead? And why was it alive a minute ago and now it's dead? And sort of discussing that. And then obviously you can start to talk more about killing animals for food and other forms of killing animals and so forth. But there's certainly a balance there between I fear that some of our teaching, whilst really well-meaning, is just putting the kind of fear of God into small children and filling them with sort of despair, and teaching them that the natural world is this fragile, endangered thing that's out there that we can't touch, that we can't go near, and we can only mourn and watch through a window or watch on the telly. And we don't want that. We want active involvement with real wildlife, and from our own encounters with wildlife, we are then motivated to take wider action, I think. And I mean, there's so much agonizing about the state of children as well, and they're always on electronic screens. And in some ways, despite all this, and despite the sort of statistics that show our young people have very poor levels of mental health as well, you know, children are kind of leading the way on this with the school climate strikes, you know, Fridays for the Future, and you know, perhaps we don't need to worry too much about our children too, because certainly whatever's happened in school over the last 10 years has helped create a more motivated generation of 16-year-olds than we've seen for a good few generations, certainly more motivated than I was when I was 16, which is heartening and encouraging. So I guess, yeah, sorry, a long and winding answer, but I hope we don't need to worry too much.
Just to come back, I keep quoting you, but Richard there touched on lots of things that come up in the book. And in the closing of the book, you say, I hope the next generation of eco-warriors will make Greta Thunberg look timid. Which is such an aspiration. But you do actually touch, Richard, you've really nailed it there, because Patrick touches on in the book on that very theme. A couple of quotations here. Becoming more intimate with other nature is one way to recreate a healthier relationship with death and the dead. And then slightly later on, the best pets we acquire from the wild are the caterpillars, because although there's a kind of death in their pupation that requires us to let go, there follows the bonus of resurrection. Their release as butterflies is our contribution to the fabulously true fairy tale of metamorphosis. So that theme of learning to let go, I think, if I can comment on your book, is very, very strongly there. In Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Prince Mishkin says firmly, he's not a very firm character, he's such a lovely character, and he says, there is nothing that can't be taught to a child. Children are able to understand everything if it is properly explained to them. Right now, at this point, thank you very much, Richard, for your question, and thank you, Patrick, for your brilliant answer. Can we bring in Heather, who has a question? If you're able to do that, David, can we bring in Heather? There's a question about the book. Let's see, I'm all on tenterhooks at this point, finding out if our tech is going to work. So far, so good. One is tempted, and only 13 minutes from when we're told we have to end. David, are you able to bring in Heather?
I'm not, I'm afraid to say that she's left us.
Oh dear, in which case I will read out Heather's question. Patrick, love the book. What more can organisations like NWT specifically do to connect youngsters in urban areas with nature and its many benefits?
Oh, yeah, good question. Specific things to, I mean, I don't really want to kind of give suggestions for charities that I feel are doing a lot anyway, but certainly the Norfolk Wildlife Trust Children and Nature campaign, and that was sort of brought into being by John Snape, and the work that they've done, and I went to one of their days as part of Research for Wild Child out near Great Yarmouth with the Sure Start centres, where they were really Sure Start centres are for very young children, and it's more supporting parents almost, and so it's again, it's sort of giving parents who perhaps haven't had opportunities to develop any knowledge of nature to get some basic knowledge and confidence, and so that parents then have the confidence to hopefully take their children out into the wild. I live in Hoverton, which is 10 miles from the seaside, and there's children at my local school who've never been to the seaside. I mean, that's just astonishing, but you know, that's what deprivation is, and it would be great, and I'm sure NWT has lots of plans to do this, but to try and spend as much time as possible working with more I'm in the sticks, and there's obviously the, rural poverty and rural deprivation too. But to be able to work in Norfolk's urban areas and in urban areas, and to just facilitate those experiences outdoors, which I know NWT already does. But obviously, with our funding and from us, it can do more and bigger and better and just more of that. It isn't, I don't think any of it's rocket science. Certainly the time-honoured thing, and I know all these wildlife charity education officers kind of heroes for the number of pond dips they've endured. Nick, you must have endured a lot of pond dips in your time. But that works. That's ubiquitous and timeless because it works, and there's a magic about, we know less under the murky waters of our little ponds than we do about the big beasts on the African savannah. So that sort of dipping and finding a great diving beetle, my word, that's exciting. And you see children with no previous experience lapping that sort of stuff up.
Now, as completely fortuitously, the next question comes from John Snape, whom you just made reference to in your previous answer. So are you able, David, please, to bring up? Yes, we have. Is that Chris? I've got the name Chris Snape here, but is Chris Hunt the same person? Chris, was that your question that comes from John Snape? Ah, Chris Snape, yes. Was that your question that came from John Snape, please? There we are. We should have Chris Snape live speaking on behalf of John Snape.
Can you hear us?
We can.
Yeah, okay, right. Here's John.
Yes, I think I should say that I do suffer from Alzheimer's, so this is quite difficult. You're going to have to help out here.
Me?
Yes. So we've gone a bit blank, I'm afraid, which is exactly what I didn't want to happen.
You wanted to ask him about the GCSE and nature studies.
Yes, there is a proposal, I think you'll remember. A single MP, probably the green one, the only green one, has asked if...
the Brighton girl.
Yes. Asked if GCSEs can form some form of nature subject for children. It's a very, very difficult one.
Yeah, thanks, John, and lovely to hear your voice. And I interviewed John and spoke to him as part of the Research for Wild Child too. So I really appreciated your insights, John. The question about the natural history GCSE, which Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, has been the leading voice behind it, and Mary Colwell, who's a natural
wonderful.
He's brilliant and written beautifully about curlews. And there's a big curlew campaigner. She's been championing and sort of campaigning for it. I've been puzzled to see a big debate about this on Twitter, because as far as I'm concerned, it's yes, I think a natural history GCSE is a brilliant idea, but I think the concerns are that it somehow feels like it's ghettoizing nature, and then you sort of tick a box and a few children go and do it who are interested in it anyway, and it doesn't really add anything. Obviously, it's vital that if we have a natural history GCSE, it doesn't detract from the idea of getting nature and ecosystems and modern teaching about climate change and biodiversity and extinction into the national curriculum all the way through school. But I don't see why it's anything other than a good thing, and it should be welcomed, but it's only one step in rewilding our education system, or rewilding the national curriculum.
One axis of the debate has been, again, the very same thing many of us have been talking about this evening, about making it accessible to people of all backgrounds, people of all ethnic minorities, city dwellers, country dwellers, and that needs to be part of it structurally, doesn't it? So that it is something that is de facto available to everybody in our society, and not just those white people who live in the countryside, who are upper middle class, and what might be associated with natural history through our history. But no, make it something accessible and available to everybody.
And the devil's in the detail too, in that, children used to do geography because it meant lots of great field trips and outings, and and natural history GCSE without any good field trips is not really, you've got to have some. It's got to come with some good field trips, and again, so that might be giving 14, 15-year-olds their first experience of being out in wild Britain.
Yeah, there needs to be some mud involved, doesn't there? Yes, as you say in the last, now let me see if I can find I absolutely love this. Playing in mud is endorsed by Peppa Pig. So it's not even mildly controversial in the eyes of wider society. There you have it from Peppa Pig. Now, sadly, I've been told that I will be fired, and not only fired, but sent to jail if we go over an hour. And so I mustn't go over an hour. So we don't have time to answer any more questions. However, one was asked that Rachel asked about Patrick's favourite wild thing to do with your family. If I can just answer that for you, there is a section at the end of the book that is ideas about getting outside and exploring nature, and that is one of the most wonderful aspects of the book. So if you read the book, Rachel, you will see what Patrick's favourite things to do with his family. I mean, you even talk about what works particularly for your individual children. It's lovely.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of different things, isn't there? And so different children respond in different ways to different experiences. But I do think that the main thing as a family, if you can cultivate a local patch, children will form bonds with almost any area, no matter how underwhelming it is to us adults, no matter how scruffy the little bit of park or riverside or canal side or cemetery or whatever it is. It's like, if we can form a relationship with that and make that your local patch and go there with the children fairly regularly, and there's always, the outdoors, green space is a wonderful giver of serendipity, and there's always new things happening, and it's amazing how children grow up and they discover new ways of relating to this particular green space. And it really does not have to be a kind of beautiful space. It can be any scruffy bit of land where some wildness happens, and then I think that's just a wonderful way to start.
Mm-hmm. It really is. So before we wrap up, which will be very imminent, just go through the housekeeping things. Of course, this has been a free event. However, should anybody have been moved to make a donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust's Children and Nature Fund, you can do that through the link that David has posted in the chat. But if you can't see that for some reason, it is simply norfolkwildlifetrust.org.uk/CAN. And that is the wonderful fund which John Snape helped to inspire and set up at Norfolk Wildlife Trust because of this critical importance of getting children relating to nature. Should you wish to buy Patrick's wonderful book, and I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't, and indeed all of his other books, they're available from Wild Sounds and Books, our wonderful friends in Salt House who stock our visitor centres. And again, David has posted a link, but if you can't find that, it is wildsounds.com, and if you go through the link that David has posted, 10% will be donated to Norfolk Wildlife Trust from the sale of all of the books that you buy. So go in, spend fortunes on books about nature, especially Patrick Barkham's books. And the final one is that this has been our inaugural event online of this nature, and so apologies on my part for my fluffing around and not knowing what I'm doing. Should you have any suggestions, should you have any ideas, should you have any feedback on the way that we've done, get rid of the idiot in the flowery shirt. If you have any suggestions about the way we've done things, we would love to hear them, because we're really hoping to make this a regular thing. So if you have ideas of people we might interview, of events we might do, of ways we could improve on what we've done, we'd love to hear them. And the web address, please, for that, the email address is info@norfolkwildlifetrust.org.uk, info@norfolkwildlifetrust.org.uk. So please let us know if we can improve in some way, if you've enjoyed this, if there's something we could do to tweak it that will make it a better experience for you, because we'd love to do more of these. Patrick, we have 2 minutes. What would you like?
Well, shall we whip through some questions really fast?
Really, really fast. Oh no, I've closed the Q&A. Let me just
read
have
them
a
out. No,
yeah, I don't think so. They're
actually
quite complex. I have one last question for you.
Okay.
When are you writing a book for children?
Sorry, say that again.
When are you writing a book for children?
I have written 2 books for children, and sadly neither of them have been accepted by any publisher and published, so they're probably a bit ropey, to be honest.
And I can't believe it, you have the most wonderful imagination, and you see the world with the same joy and fascination as a child. So Patrick, to you, a huge thank you for joining us this evening. It's been a joy from my part, and I'm sure that all of the participants feel the same. And thank you to everybody who has participated. Thank you for all your questions. Sorry to those we haven't been able to answer your questions. Thank you for being with us. If you have missed any part of it, you can find it all online very soon. Follow the link that will be placed on the Norfolk Wildlife Trust website. With that, I think we're done. Patrick, thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for brilliant questions too.
Excellent. With that, good night to everybody. Thank you, David, for support. And we look forward to seeing you at another Norfolk Wildlife Trust online event very soon. Goodbye.